Hey folks, it's almost the end of 2017, the 100-year anniversary of the Russian Revolution. And because of that, because it's nearing the end of the year, I knew I had to make this video. Because whenever you go any place in the USA or around the world and you talk to people about socialism or communism, a lot of people will tell you that the Russian Revolution was a conspiracy by Wall Street. Well, that's not the truth, and I'm going to dissect that conspiracy theory for you point by point. Most of the people promoting this conspiracy theory will point to Jacob Schiff. Now, Jacob Schiff was a Wall Street banker, a very, very wealthy individual living in New York City. And, he was very opposed to the Tsar of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II. He felt like the Tsarist government was anti-Semitic. He pointed out the pogroms that were going on. He had a long record of, working with Japan against the Tsar. He did everything he could to oppose the Tsarist government in Russia. And it's documented very well that Jacob Schiff did fund an organization in Russia that was working against the Tsar, trying to have a more democratic government, something called the Russian Freedom Group or the Russian Freedom Organization. Well, this group did want to bring down the Tsar, but there's no evidence that they ever supported the Bolsheviks. And when the Tsar was toppled in February of 1917, that was the first revolution that happened in 1917, a lot of different forces supported it. Most of the Russian population supported it. A lot of rich people in Russia supported it because the Tsar was seen as incompetent. He was losing the war. Russia was aligned with the USA and Britain and France in World War I, which was happening at the time, and the Tsar was incompetent. He was losing the war, and so many forces thought it was best that he be forced out. That was the February Revolution. The October Revolution was when the Bolsheviks took power, and that was a completely different revolution. That was when the Bolsheviks took power and created the Soviet government that eventually led to the creation of socialism in the Soviet Union and the surrounding countries. That was a completely different operation, and no one can point to any evidence that Jacob Schiff supported the Bolshevik Revolution. And actually, Jacob Schiff was a key ally of the World Zionist Organization. And the World Zionist Organization was very hostile to the Russian Revolution and to the Bolsheviks. They started actively working to try and get Jewish people to leave Soviet Russia. That was one of their big activities, and get them to relocate to Palestine. Furthermore, the World Zionist Organization saw Marxism as its greatest enemy, because Marxism, it cut away at what they considered to be the Jewish national identity. Zionism is Jewish nationalism. And they were threatened by Marxism because they felt like Marxism would kind of erode the national identity of Jewish people. The class struggle, workers against the bosses, would take away from the unique identity of Jews. And so the World Zionist Organization was very, very anti-Marxist and anti-communist at that time. They were very, very hostile to the Bolsheviks and to the Russian Revolution. And Jacob Schiff was a primary funder of the World Zionist Organization. Now, Jacob Schiff died, and interestingly, in the Bronx in New York City, there was the Jacob Schiff Center, which is a synagogue that was paid for by his estate. And it was one of the most anti-communist and pro-Zionist synagogues in New York City at the time. In the 1930s, a lot of Jewish people in New York City were attracted to Marxism, but the Jacob Schiff Center was one of the places that worked against Marxism in the Jewish community in New York City and was promoting Zionism. So this idea that Jacob Schiff is somehow responsible for the Russian Revolution, that's just frankly absurd. Now, other theories will come in as well. People will talk about, like, the Rothschilds, this wealthy banking family in Britain. They'll say that the Rothschilds didn't like Russia. They were trying to destroy Russia. Well, after the Russian Revolution happened, you'll know that then what happened next was the Russian Civil War, a civil war between the Bolsheviks, Red Army, and the White Army of anti-communists. And all over the world, different countries sent their troops to Russia to try and put down the Russian Revolution. Well, one of those countries was Britain, the country where the Rothschilds were located. And one of the main activities that was done by the British troops was to go to Azerbaijan and Baku, where oil fields had been set up. There was a lot of oil in Baku, and one of the main things the British troops were doing was trying to seize back the oil fields that belonged to the Rothschilds and were connected with the Rothschilds, their oil fields, trying to seize them from the Bolsheviks. So if the Bolsheviks were working for the Rothschilds, why would the British troops be dispatched to Baku to try and seize their property from the Bolsheviks and prevent the Bolsheviks from taking their oil fields away? Now, during the five-year plans, which was the industrialization of Russia beginning in 1928, Stalin started industrializing the country. There were a lot of technicians from the USA, from Western Europe, who were hired to go to Russia. There were a lot of different corporations that had joint ventures with the Soviet industries, the Soviet steel industry. I know that the Koch brothers' father, the father of the Koch brothers, Fred Koch, he actually went to the Soviet Union and was paid to help them set up their oil industry. He made a lot of money from it. There were a lot of joint ventures going on. But the foreign policy of the Western countries was almost exclusively, from the time the Soviet Union was born until the time the Soviet Union collapsed, it was almost exclusively dedicated to trying to overthrow the Soviet government. Socialism was seen as a threat to the power of Western capitalism. The centrally planned economy of the Soviet Union was seen as a threat, and the foreign policy of the Western capitalist countries was about destroying it. Now, there was a temporary alliance during the Second World War, and there were times where the Roosevelt government was being rather friendly to Soviet Russia, but for the most part, the foreign policy of the Western countries was about trying to overthrow and overturn and crush socialism in the Soviet Union. So the idea that the Russian Revolution was just a vast Wall Street conspiracy is pretty absurd. The result of the Russian Revolution was the creation of socialism, and it was a counter to Wall Street's power all over the world. It resulted in Russia becoming a booming powerhouse of industry that was competing with them on the world markets. At no point was Wall Street happy about the Russian Revolution. Now, did they offer to do business with them at various points? Sure. Was there, before the revolution, an effort by certain forces in the United States and elsewhere to bring down the Tsar, who was viewed as an incompetent leader? Yes. Now, one interesting thing about this myth that goes around, this idea that the Russian Revolution was a Wall Street conspiracy, is that one of the main people that went around promoting it were the Nazis in Germany. They fitted in with their anti-Jewish, thing, Jewish bankers, Jewish communists, and whatnot. That's a Nazi trope. And one of the most interesting things about that is that it is actually documented that the Kaiser and the German government during World War I did give some amount of support to Lenin. Lenin was opposed to the war. That was one of the main points of the Bolshevik Party, was that they wanted to end World War I. And it is interesting that the Bolsheviks do admit that at some point they got some assistance of some kind from the Germans. So, the German Nazis were always, raving about how it was, Wall Street bankers and whatnot that were behind the Russian Revolution. And that's rather interesting because the whole world basically acknowledges that more or less there was some German support for Lenin. Lenin was enabled to get to Russia in April of 1917 to return to the country because he had some level of support from Germans. So it's almost like they're trying to cover that up when they make this allegation. But I'll go even further than that. This allegation basically, it says that the alternative to Western capitalism is just a fraud. It's a big phony. That's basically what they're trying to say. And it really bothers me that I'm making this video, and I'm having to make this video, because you would think that this would be something that all the people in the USA that were trying to promote socialism or communism would be writing about all the time and exposing as a fraud. You would think, because, this discredits it. If we're going around, if socialists and leftists and Marxists are going around and telling people, hey, we want to overturn the rule of Wall Street, you would think that if someone said they had proof that Wall Street had paid for the Russian Revolution, they would want to refute that. And that's what I don't understand. I'm talking to you, leftists. Why am I having to make this video? Why does every Marxist group in the USA not have a pamphlet refuting the lies about Jacob Schiff and all of this? Why hasn't there been an effort to refute this? I don't understand that. If you want people to believe in Marxism, you've got to counter the arguments people make. A lot of people have been convinced by a lot of dishonesty about Jacob Schiff and other things. They have been convinced that the Bolshevik Revolution was a Wall Street conspiracy. And I want to know why it's only me and a few other people that have even bothered to refute this lie. It's a very dangerous lie, and it's very easy to refute. You can look at who Jacob Schiff was, and there's other things. So let me just add, they always talk about the fact that Trotsky was living in New York City at the time of the Russian Revolution. Well, he was in exile. He was a revolutionary activist in Russia. He was in exile, and New York City was a place to live in exile. He edited a newspaper called Novy Mir, which was like New World, something like that, a Russian language newspaper for leftists. And then when the revolution happened, he went back to Russia. Not a conspiracy there. So the whole story that the Russian Revolution is a Wall Street plot is false. And I feel like anyone who considers themselves to be an expert on Marxism who hears this should be able to refute it. And I'm rather surprised that socialist groups don't pay more attention to trying to refute this falsehood.